Hello. How nice. I've spent the day before I spend the evening teaching online students with these days, distant learning, but so close to the detail of each of their expectations, their own morphology, their own capacity to organize their fingers, for me to find the fingerings that might better shape, sculpt the phrase they have in mind, and if they don't, then it's up to me to find and how to define them, to choose the given phrasing like a bow change or a breathing for another instrument, because the piano needs it musically, not physically. And then bring that within the style that is not the same for each genre and style we play on piano. Even if we don't use the instruments of the time, or nor we have the ears of the time, or the imagination, or the capacity of being amazed by whatever audacity there is in the harmonic or melodic of whichever aspect, since we are outside of that time when most of the people of the past studied the music of their time with their masters of their time. And we, in fact, study their past in our present. And we have to define for our modern instrument, the piano, how to define the different styles while expressing the element of expression that corresponded to their time period. Sometimes I find that I'm brought to the brink of giving the students too much freedom by suggesting too much creativity, by saying, oh, you know, in that time period, they could improvise, they could take liberty with this or that decorative pattern. After all, it was interchangeable. Yes, but really? Meaning, the way they are taught before they come to study with me, inevitably, in order to bring them to have a discipline, was to recite the scores, and the scores defined the right note from the wrong note. And God forbids, I don't like the constant fear of the wrong note, like some kind of dictatorship that defines the good performance, like only a series of obstacles that would be correctly negotiated, and then the musical interpretation would come as a bonus. In other words, the interpretation, the intention, and wrong notes doesn't matter as much as first clean. So that's why I speak to you about my necessity to find always a fingering or a disposition of the two hands to retake the texture of the score part in different ways so that it can be more reliable according to the fingering options or perhaps the dispositions and all that. But ultimately, when I feel free to suggest creative points of view for their interpretation, I also try to be very careful because I so want them to bring the best of who they are at the audition jury examinations with this piece. But I know very well that too much creativity would be considered at best wrong and at worst unnecessary. At this level now, while they're students. Of course, once they grow up and become their own scholars, then they can make conferences and present interpretations that englobe the performance practice of the past that intended to do some even limited or more or less developed improvisations, transpositions, or even transcriptions. Those was inevitably part of the interpretation choices. Now, then again, the education being more specifically oriented towards a skill and not a general musicianship, the skill of a pianist is to perform. and therefore all what ingredients you will be able to input in the performance will correspond with the political correctness of the publishers and therefore of the competitors who would play that. So you would be at a disadvantage if you play very original with some personal creativity. That wouldn't be appreciated by jurors, or because in a way it's all done in the term of making everybody play a certain objective truth, let's put it this way, and not subjective opinions about, of course, the phrasing, the tempo are variables of adjustment, which is good, because the resonance of a piano and the resonance of acoustics in the hall or in the room or in the studio can determine a different approach of the traction of the pulse, despite of what you have imagined or idealized in your inner hearing before you start playing it and visualizing the piece in front of you in a glimpse of a second as an ephemeral construction that you're going to go through in the demonstration of your musical storytelling. And then it reveals itself differently to you because the given instrument in a given acoustic on a given time cannot do that, either because for whatever reasons, nervousness, tension in the arm, heavier keyboard than expected, or not ability. Well, the ability to adapt comes with experience, so you cannot ask the student to have it all. And the experience and adaptability and dealing with the unexpected, and then sound coherent as if they planned all the details within the grand scheme and the details and the grand scheme. Whew. Sometimes I wish I had the capacity, because after all, yes, I would like them to gain from my experience. I cannot shortcut their own developmental experiences, which will go inevitably by, backing from dead ends. In order to find their truth about the tempo, the phrasing, the pedaling, the articulation, the breathing, musically speaking, of course, not physically, as I said, for the instrument, depending of the stylistic understanding and comparing it to other genres of the same composer, having written symphonies, operas, quartets, and trying to find an imagination in their inner ear how to match this to their piano playing. Wow. All that could be done in a lesson, in a semester, in a year, in a degree, that would be easy, but no, of course not. It has to be patiently placed in, and then soaked in, and then like tea leaves macerate until it becomes part of the score, the structure of the music you play. So the coating and the essence become somehow completely connected. And there is no about even a thin leaf between the two. Because in a way, if the interpretation is too subjective, then it's more about playing what the music means to me rather than music itself, which means by itself what it is. So how much should I keep out of involving myself in a ritenuto, in an accelerando, in a suspension, in a syncopation, in a hemiola, in an embellishment, in a graceful ornamentation before the beat, on the beat, slightly rubato in order to match with the bass, or slightly delay from the bass to bring out the melody. Plethora of details that are so probably almost sensual, emotional, rather than rational and organized as the structure or the bridge between sections, and how you negotiate a new tempo change, or do you interact with the tempos because of the different sections, textures, rhythmic pulse and harmonic tempi. In other words, give the illusion of keeping the traction of the tempo, but at the same time being flexible to adjust to the different expectations of the melodic, lyrical, if it is thematic material with repeated notes, melodically or not, or something more percussive and more driven and more rising, even more perhaps impressive in terms of expression of energy purely, compared to something where you play in a more operatic way, an aria where your playing section then will sound more like contemplative. So between the energized and the contemplative and the transitions in between, some things have to be strategized in order to bring you to the right tempo in the right section, not too slow, not too fast, in order to go through the whole vision of the piece in terms of structure and storytelling and phrasing and all these punctuations that delay or conclude a statement. If the syncopation is tied to a, so to say, deceptive cadence, it delays the arrival point. And then sometimes the arrival point leaves like 3 points after itself. It's not conclusive. It just lets itself rest there, and then you prepare either the next movement to connect, or you organize. In other words, your thoughts follow the thoughts which follow the thoughts. Now, regardless of the interpretational tempi markings or expression indications that composer wrote, which were, you could realize how much they mean and how little they define. If not, in a way, there would be different interpretations, and that's the richness of it. But of course, when the interpretation becomes so different from the political correct expectation, since after all, the students conclude their degree by an exam jury or a competition, then they have to integrate all this free thinking that I liked them to develop within the style and the good taste of the expression of the time period they are playing, of the past today on today's instrument, as well as not to overstate it, because what if they are considered eccentric and therefore not respectful of the text, which is the printed text. And my approach of authenticity and respect of the text is a little bit freer than perhaps the publishers do. Of course, they have their own source materials, and comparing them and bringing them to be like Chopin and some other composers who wrote several copies for several publishers by themselves or by students of theirs or ghostwriters. And then to capture the essence beyond the detail, but justify the detail in the positioning of the detail, in the expression that is almost spoken. In fact, that's the beauty of live music, is that you plan, you organize, you practice, you repeat, in order to play it once through, in the sense of how it's supposed to be played through. And then all these innuendos, all these desires for tempo freedom become, for instance, or phrasing freedom, become dangerous because they distract you. And then comes the most interesting situation, is that students practice on whatever they can find to practice instruments-wise. And then they play on instruments that they rarely have time to approach in concert halls or exam rooms or jury rooms. And then they have to render all these subtle group of details within almost no time to try, or perhaps 5 minutes they give them to try the piano, and then the piano becomes feared, like, will it betray me or will it serve me? Of course, the simple solution would be to teach them to play everything mezzo forte detached, so that all notes speak with a beginning and an end, like flossed teeth, clear, and organized. And then you use the pedals to play legato with the right foot and softer dynamics with the left foot for the una corda. Okay, that is obviously, said like this, you understand even the tone of my voice, that it's a caricature. But then the opposite is more subtly dangerous, and you have to have the right weight control of the touch on the piano in order to be able to express voicing, inner voicing, legato, true finger legato, not pedal legato, in order to preserve some harmonic or melodic integrity to the section. Of course, you're not responsible for the acoustics, and it might be blurrier because of an acoustic that's more resonant than another. You're not responsible for the action of the piano, the way it comes, the way you have to play, and they say, that's it, now, at this time, play it. And in a way, it's the sum of all your practicing, all your hours of evaluating almost the grammage of each fingertip, how to shape it right. And then it becomes a random situation. And that disappoints you if you cannot control it enough. Perhaps not fully, but just enough. That's where the reliable fingerings come in handy, because all of a sudden they take away from your worry about the details in order to create the capacity to go through the piece on this unknown territory that is the new acoustics of the place with a new piano on which you might never play again, but you have to play one of your unforgettable interpretations, and then you can be betrayed or not controlling enough with your fingers the unevenness of the action. Said like this, it sounds unfair. It sounds unreasonable. Who defines a good piano and who defines a good acoustic? It would be like if in sports somebody practices with a different size of court length if they play tennis or something, and then they have to be as organized in their muscular memory to place the ball in this or that corner in order to win a point, but they do it because, in a way, some parameters are always the same, or at least tend to be, the pressure of the strings on the racket or the length of the court, so, and then the surface of the court. So you take in account all these things in sports, and you don't expect people to play as subtle and as refined if the court was, let's say, round for a tennis game. That would be possible. But because piano playing involves a lot of technique to cover up difficulty, like most art, like ballet, like singing, where the effort in the artistic sense is supposed to not be seen, it's not displayed, it's practiced, it's learned, it's incorporated in the expression of the art. Would it be a gesture in the dance, a singing voice with a control of the air call on the pianist, with the capacity to speak and tell notes in a way that they sit in our soul. I find it very difficult to control all of that, as a matter of fact. And I think that a professional cannot always control it, let less a student. And so the experience comes in account. Oh, wait. Yes, of course the experience comes in account. But you cannot expect a student to have the experience to have played on any kind of piano, any kind of music, let less music they just learned, so they feel it's more like an obstacle course that they hope to pass through without trouble. And that is a first worry, not that is the only worry, but necessary. And I understand that's what motivates them to make sure that it's also for their self-esteem. If they only can play well and clean under some very rare circumstances of a piano that action is light, not too heavy, or even compared to uneven, no surprises, and then the acoustic enhances things, unlike the practice room or a practice studio, or I don't know, upright piano on which you play to practice. So ideally, of course, students should have concert halls, concert grand pianos, possibly orchestras on hand every time they practice, even if it's an orchestra for a concerto, for a 15 minutes rehearsal of a given section that you learned, because it's not a sonata, it's meant ultimately to play with the other musicians. And when I exactly on the piano write on the structure of the second piano score how to implement the orchestra with what it's exciting about as well as what is scary about, because the orchestra very often is not collaborative of the soloist, depending on the conductor, and the pianist has to have this acoustic in mind. When they listen to the concerto recorded, the microphone balances sometimes give them a false reality of the balance. In fact, on the stage when they play, they don't hear what they've heard in the recording between the piano and the orchestra and the orchestration. In terms of balance of solo instruments in the orchestra, of combinations that can lead to some beautiful duets between the flute and the piano in the Tchaikovsky slow movement of the concerto, or between a clarinet and the piano in a Schumann concerto, or between an oboe and, let's say, bassoon and basically woodwinds and the piano in a Mozart concerto. They are not meant to be chamber music, but they have these sections of chamber music. Then these sections for the romantic concerti in the late 19th century, really the expression of the heroism of the one versus the many. All these elements are imagined, but they are not rehearsed, they're practiced while acquiring the knowledge of the piece. Students study a concerto like a sonata, solo. So the pedaling is there to fulfill the acoustics of the room, which is dreadfully dry. And when they play in a resonant acoustic, then it becomes blurry. And if they have the orchestra on top of it, dubbing the harmonization, let's say, of the left hand's arpeggios, then the right hand is totally underwater. You don't have enough of the energy of the sound to project, without to bang, of course, to have the sound rise above the structure of the orchestra. I mean, all these things are so special. To me, I think if a pianist can practice as a studio that is with a piano that is as good, as obviously good, as a concert grand with the action, they'll be less surprised at the performance of their D-Day. Of course, there'll be always the unexpected, and that is impossible to avoid. But at least you can have for the student through, okay, the fingerings and the phrasing and the pedaling, you give them enough tools to manage to go through the piece reliably, but also with the beauty of the expression every time of the meaning of it, just like a theater player, actor embodies the role on stage live, but not the same way every time, even if they go through the same routine. If they die at the end of the piece, or they have a dramatic surprise in the middle of the theater play, it's acted, obviously, but it has to be believed as if not. And therefore, same thing with the overly practiced, repeated piano parts. They have to be believed as if they're not, but they are prepared. I find too many leaves to pass through. But I still think that I will pass through if I go under the leaves. And the dog is very excited to see me. Between lessons now during the day and lessons in the evening soon, because of students living on different continents and time zones, it feels very good to share with you these thoughts, because I so much want every lesson to bring a student all what they need. and build up little by little, because it cannot be done overnight, and how they will combine all this. Hello. The end of the day brings still the summer light, but the autumn leaves that you hear me step on already tell us that fall is there. This fall is really unusual, since I cannot be allowed to teach in person in order to keep everybody healthy, and find this kind of capacity to interact in full attentive and developed capacity of spontaneous interaction about what they play and how I can show it on the next piano to them. In the studio, they're next one to each other. So yes, they take lessons for those who are here from my studio, but I listen to them here from my home, and that's in order to preserve everybody's health. And I must say that, like all my colleagues, I have to adapt. After all, everybody adapts to that. And we do our best. The students already have enough stress to play well the piece. That's what they're supposed to do, is play well the piece. The stress I feel is how to teach them best the piece. That's my side. Sometimes I feel like a fingering leading to another can create a misunderstanding of the phrasing. And then to unlearn that is more difficult. So it's important to right away take it in account. But sometimes it's difficult to take everything in account. Sometimes you just have to expect that the student's own capacity of combination of all these learned elements will play its own, So the past students of mine know my humor, my jokes, my innuendos about how to play this or that. And then the newer students don't, so I have to be always very careful how to be, after all, that's the role of the teacher, explicit and clear. And sometimes when the piece or the exchange on the interpretation, even online, becomes a heated excitement, because the piece is exciting. After all, music is not a dead wood. It's always alive, even if stored on paper or nowadays electronically. It comes alive. And it's just so enticing and charming and marvelously spontaneous. It's almost as if written today. Of course, it's not written for us, nor for today, but it acquires that sense that for a given few moments, instance, you appropriate the piece to yourself. And I find so marvelous that students come from distant cultures in Asia, for instance, to learn the meaning of this European romantic era of longing, expecting, or classical era organization of forms, or the style galant after the Baroque, going from the sacred to the profane, and all this related to, in a way, Christianism, and of course the tonal system is an expression that language was common to many composers before Bach till Ravel. So in all these centuries, you have to define for the student, at least if they don't have it themselves in their intuition, and you can suggest differently, how to manage, how to expect, how to express, especially the tempi, the phrasing. These things you mean like a signature, like a singer's timbre of the voice. That's the pianist. You hear it by the touch, regardless which instrument they play, and we listen to them on driving on the radio, and you hear, oh, Gould, oh, Arau, oh, Rubinstein, oh, Horowitz. Well, if all my students don't become each any of these, they will set their own standards for themselves. And I'm profoundly honored and responsible and respecting of their expectations of me towards what they want, need to build in order to get there. Perhaps not right away, perhaps in a second or third reading later in their life as a career performing or recording or perhaps writing about and all this and all that. But it started somewhere where I was next to them, or in these days next to the computer, and to them through the technologies, but mostly in order to be with them for their first reading of a piece that I've lived for with several decades of life. Not that it's given me all its truths, but that I can find some things that can help them find their own rather than ask them or give them the example how to imitate mine. That's why I don't like to say I like it better or you should play like I like it. I rather try to explain, and if not, I try to ask them to define what they feel in it or what they would like to bring in it, and then I help them bring it, even if it's not my interpretation. After all, I'm not teaching myself, I'm teaching them. And I respect each individual of them, regardless of their cultures, regardless of all, because sometimes, most of the time, the acquired family, the acquired taste, the acquired friendship becomes as meaningful as the family of birth or the place of birth where you belong to without choice, but it's also your mother tongue and it's the way you've been. Everybody has a different, of course, path in life to get to the point to which I work with them before they go to other parts of branches of their life. And I feel very honored and enthused to be the confidant of their pianistic hopes.